David, I'm quite excited for today's show, today's broadcast of David Hawkins' Discovery CSI, which will be starting in just an hour. How are you this morning, David?
I'm very well, but as you know, I had a little contretemps. My apartment got flooded, so I'm now in a motel.
Right. I heard about that and remember it, but I didn't realize it was still ongoing. That's quite a frustrating hassle. But yet again, David, this is another example that I hope people will consider when I make an appeal for them to join us as sponsors in viewing our sponsor exclusive content on Subscribestar and Patreon. Some people tell me that I'm talking about it too much, but curiously, those are almost never the people that have stepped up to actually sponsor the show. And, in order to keep it going, you've got the daily expenses that anybody has. I hope that people will visit patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. These are the resources that you and I use to keep the show going and to make it possible for us to do the show each week and to do the exciting trips. You and I have now done 2 international trips, although for you it was just driving into the city. For me, it was international the first time when I came to see you in Vancouver, but we've been to London, as everybody saw a short while ago. And today is going to be, David, our final sort of chapter in the London adventure. Later today, when we begin the sponsor-exclusive broadcast, we're going to be showing a video that you and I created where we went on a walking tour of London's Whitechapel neighborhood and learned quite a lot about Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most exciting things that I've done in this, if profession's the right word, because we do rely on subscriptions. But when we came back, my mind was racing, it always seems to, but particularly stimulated by that tour with Jack the Ripper. And at the beginning of the tour, I don't know if the guy was a Cockney who was a host showing us around.
Jamie,
he did say that he was ready to take input from anyone. And I briefly inserted sometime during that walk that I thought it might be interesting to explore the possibility that Jack was not a Jack, that he was a Jane. And specifically Jane Addams, who had been staying at Toynbee Hall with her female partner, Ellen Starr, during the period, and I'm trying to nail it down, but she may very well have made 3 visits, or 2 visits at least, to Toynbee Hall, right at the epicenter of what are known as the canonical murders attributed to Jack the Ripper. But that was only after someone purporting to be Jack the Ripper had written a letter signing themselves off as Jack the Ripper, and it was written in red ink because whoever wrote that letter, and I thought it was a rather educated script, basically said that they wanted to use blood, but it had dried too quickly, something to that effect, so they had to use red ink. But isn't that a fascinating juxtaposition of events stretching back to 1888? Over to you.
I mean, the whole thing is quite fascinating. I really knew very little about Jack the Ripper until we began our conversations. It's so interesting what we're doing with Crowdsource the Truth, because every day I've got different guests and everybody's got a different focus. So what it does for the viewers is it gives us this collection of information that perhaps on one level seems unrelated, but then as we persistently follow these lines, they all seem related. David, I want to let you know that Michelle Den is watching us on Crowdsource the Truth 2 on YouTube right now. A lot of people realize that the Jason Goodman channel, the 89,000 strong Jason Goodman channel, is under persistent attack by social engineers. So people can watch these live streams on Crowdsource the Truth 2 on YouTube. Michelle is telling everyone that David gives almost daily excellent updates from Patreon. I agree with that. And for people who haven't yet seen David's Patreon page, please make your way over to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards. You can sponsor David there and you can enjoy those daily posts. You're also going to get a simulcast of our sponsor exclusive video that's starting in just under an hour. That always plays on David's channel, as well as patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. So David, how did your opinion change after this tour, or did it?
It didn't change, but it deepened, if you will, because as you know, we both went in the belief that many of these events are actually being staged, and what looks like maybe a random killing, multiple shooting at a school or whatever it is, the fact that things seem to be so synchronized with a putative script, if that's the right word, that is to say, someone has scripted the event to come. Various assets, or I believe in the live action role play world, they call them character classes. Various character classes are pulled into the crime scene to do some specific task, for example, take away evidence or plant evidence, and then that particular character class is moved away and replaced by another class that might be specialists in injecting fake news or taking down or undermining or ridiculing or bankrupting people like you and me, because I think we're both experiencing tremendous pressure from a group that I'd like to give a name to in the world of character classes, which is the BBC's inner party enforcers. Now, as you know, we visited BBC Broadcasting House, we crossed the road and we went into the Langham Hotel, which from a historical point of view, in terms of great crimes, is fascinating because the Langham Hotel was commissioned in 1865, the year of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And the Langham Hotel was the first great hotel, if you will, to have a telegraph office. So when Jacob Reuters managed to get a message into London a few hours or several hours before London, if you will, woke up to the fact that Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated, I believe that message came through the Langham Hotel telegraph office and then was fed out to various wealthy people in the city. And basically, they were able to front run the impact on the stock market or whatever other markets were around at the time of the assassination of a president. And I believe the same process was repeated, except the technology was changed, because back then they would have used the cable telegraph. And in the JFK case of 1963, they were probably using the Telstar satellite to front run news of the assassination so that some wealthy insiders could make a great deal of money.
Yeah.
So I started looking at the profile of Jane Addams, actually yesterday and today, because knowing that we were going to be talking about her in the Patreon part of the show, I was troubled by my lack of understanding about what might motivate her or what might make her a reasonable suspect. And I'll just read something from a text that I've just saw. It's a book called Feminist Interpretations of Jane Addams. And what it says is, presuming chastity as women's natural state, Addams envisaged progress as female power to create a sexually pure society in which women would protect and patrol the borders of patriarchal marriage. Well, how does that grab you, Jason?
Well, it certainly sounds like something that might be said about a person who would perhaps despise prostitution.
You've nailed it, right? And so let's say hypothetically, geographically and chronologically, she's in position, I think, to have murdered those prostitutes in Whitechapel. Whether she did or not, or whether she used agents, I don't know. But when she was staying at Toynbee Hall, as I say, that was the epicenter of the 5 canonical murders, within walking distance of each, she was staying at Toynbee Hall with her female partner, Ellen Starr. Now, the pair of them may have gone out in an evening and encountered some women who had not been kidnapped and extorted into prostitution, but actually had entered that career, if you will, in a voluntary state. Now, the question I propose to our listeners, and I think this is, from a psychological point of view, fascinating thing to explore, is if they saw, the two women saw prostitutes as targets to be eliminated, if you will, because they would be tempting men out of marriage, heterosexual marriage. Um, Maybe there's a motive there. Basically, it's beyond me in terms of sexual dynamics for killing them in the way that they did. All I'm saying, I guess, is she has a motive that I dimly understand. She would have the opportunity because she's in the geographical area when the killings take place, and the weapons presumably are readily available because Toynbee Hall was a place where young people were fed. And so, just like I believe Ushan Khan at the Fishmongers' Hall took a knife from the fishmongers to stab Jack Merritt in the washroom, there's a weapon to hand. Alternatively, in this theory that I've developed about guild hotels on sportsbook time, maybe the butchers, the worshipful company of butchers, could supply a knife to Jane Addams so she could unfortunately gut the poor victims, and then they would take away the knife so she could go back to Toynbee Hall and stay that night with a nearly perfect alibi. Over to you.
David, Toynbee Hall, it's in London. How do I spell it? T O
Yes, it's right
Y
at the
N
epicenter
D.
of the Whitechapel.
There we
See?
go.
So again?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to bring it up on the map so people can get an idea of where that is. There we are. Yeah. It's interesting because, I mean, again, this ties in with some of the other things that you and I have classically spoken about. It seems that the Picton brothers, or whoever it was that was doing the killing there at the pig farm, also regard prostitutes as targets for elimination. I suppose some people could justify the reprehensible act of murder, certainly far worse than prostitution, by, as you're saying, discounting these people as morally reprehensible for engaging in sex for money and disrupting families and all that kind of thing.
Well, that's right. So, as you know, what I always doing is, can I find some patented technology that would facilitate live action role play back in the 19th century? And lo and behold, we have the cable telegraph, of which one of the earliest spurs from the General Post Office was evidently run into the Langham Hotel. So I just revisited a few things that I knew somewhere in my memory bank, and it turns out the first murderer to be apprehended through the use of the cable telegraph was one John Towell in 1845, who had apparently used prussic acid to kill his mistress. He was a Quaker, and he was seen leaving the crime scene. And he got onto a train, and they sent a cable telegraph message describing this guy. And he was arrested when he checked into a railway station further down the line from London or wherever the murder was committed. And he was arrested. Ultimately, he was tried, and he was hanged.
Yeah.
Right. And then jumping through to 1910, so that was 1845, which obviously 20 years before the Abraham Lincoln assassination, and 65, so another 20, 40 years before the murders in Whitechapel. Then in 1910, a Dr. Hawley Crippen, Crippen, he was tracked down after murdering, I think, his mistress with a dose of scopolamine. I don't know how to pronounce that, which is a kind of hyoscine. It's a calming agent, but in large doses, it can be fatal. So you've got two people, one arrested as a result of the use of the cable telegraph, and another in 1910 arrested as a result of the use of the wireless Marconi telegraph system in 1910. Now, did you know, or maybe the listeners would know, and I come back to, I think you and I, when we went on that trip, we realized, I think collectively, I don't want to put words in your mouth, how valuable it is to go to the scene of a crime, whether it's 150 years ago, stay in a hotel, talk with people in the area, not necessarily because they're deeply informed, but actually the fact that they're not informed is almost informative as the fact that if they would be informed. Because, we went to the BBC, they knew nothing, right? Even though there's a statue of George Orwell outside, and there's a statue up on the wall outside Broadcasting House overlooking Langham Hotel, where, again, thanks to one of our listeners, we were puzzling about what the word obsculta meant, carved on that Eric Gill book, right? Now, let me describe, while you're perhaps looking for that particular one, that's just around the corner from the one at the central door. You've got what looks like a sexualized boy, naked Christ being crucified, and two, dare I say it, angels, at least they've got wings, one of whom is holding the book with the carvings, presumably in the Gill script, obsculta, underneath the boy's private parts. It's an extremely sexual, and I would think from a Christian point of view, offensive, an offensive image. And I showed that to someone, I talked to one of the coffee places I frequent, who spends a lot of time studying the Bible. And I said, well, what's your interpretation of this? And he said, it's sacrilegious. Why wouldn't Christians actually rip that sculpture off the wall and smash it to pieces? Because what is it saying here? Now, obsculta, again, thanks to someone who sent a message in about what it meant, apparently it's the first two words in Latin of the Benedictine Creed, which means listen and obey, or listen, comma, obey. Now, that's outside the world's largest broadcaster that is capable, and is continuing to do, of injecting fake news in 20 languages around the world, including, to the present, in my opinion, the news of a wannabe pandemic involving the coronavirus. But anyway, I want to stay back in the Jane the Ripper period. All I'm saying is it would appear this sculpture was commissioned in 1934 from Eric Gill, who was a pedophile. He had sex with his own daughters, the family dog, and his wife.
Crazy.
He was an extraordinarily gifted artist, if you will. And people, particularly the intellectuals among us, are struggling with, can they accept the rapist pedophile at the same time as the quality of his art? And
I say
I
no.
absolutely accept. Well, yes, because you see what that means in 1934 is, I believe, the culture of pedophilia and listen and obey, which is pure, for me, 1984 from a worldwide broadcaster, is unacceptable to we the people. Now, a couple of days back, I came across this term when I was studying live action role play of character class, right? So I look at that sculpture and I think, well, what are the characters here that we're talking about? We're talking about something that looks to me extraordinarily evil, right? If I think of the George Orwell sitting through hours during World War II in room 101 in Broadcasting House, and subsequently including or incorporating room 101 in his fictional dystopian novel written in 1949 called 1984. And he describes room 101 as the torture room, where you break the bonds between two people. I think in 1984, there was Winston, the man, and Julia, his lover, or they hoped to be lovers, or they were in love with each other. And this was deemed to be a violation of what Big Brother or the BBC's inner party deemed appropriate. So in the particular case of Winston, his phobia from his youth was rats. So what they did in room 101, the fictional room 101, is strap a cage over the face of Winston with a couple of doors that could be lifted and allow two large rats to start eating his face. Well, actually, whether you got a phobia about rats or not, it's pretty horrifying.
Yeah.
And what he was told was, this is in the fiction, if you say do it to your girlfriend, we will stop doing it to you. Right? Apparently, we don't know exactly what was done to Julia, right? But she went through the same process or a similar process with a phobia, and presumably they both betrayed each other. And then, having fractured the relationship between two human beings based on a legitimate form of love, they could repurpose the dynamics of their affection towards the love of Big Brother. So I think going back to the earliest use of the cable telegraph system in 1845 to track down this John Towell, who was ultimately hanged for murdering, I think it was his mistress, I believe what the inner party of the BBC and the owners, staff, and guests at the Langham Hotel have been doing is they've been broadcasting using every modern form of communication they can the mantra of listen and obey. That is to say, they belong or deem themselves to be part of an inner party. I think the bonds that hold it together are actually pedophile bonds, right? Then on the next level, you have the outer party, and then you have the proletariat. And I think the outer party are the people who earn kickbacks or whatever from torturing or bankrupting or ridiculing or undermining the credibility of what they deem to be the proletariat. And unfortunately, I think they believe that the proletariat includes you and me, and they're about to be disabused, I think. Over to you.
Well put, David. Well, yeah, I mean, we should probably define a little bit this concept of the live action role play. It's possible that some people haven't heard of it. I never heard of it before I started doing broadcasts on YouTube, and suddenly all these people were accusing me of being involved in a live action role play. It's not the case.
Well, in its modern form, where people dress up as knights with plastic swords or foam swords, and they rent a castle and they play a sort of live action Dungeons and Dragons with the games master. That, I understand, was sort of kicked off in the 1980s with a big movement both in the United States and the United Kingdom. But I go back to live action role playing to the guilds of the City of London, which is back to the 13th or the 12th century, because what they were doing then, they were staging mystery, miracle, or morality plays, where, let's say, the tanners, the worshipful company of tanners, would put all of the material and assets together to represent Lucifer. The carpenters, I suppose, might come and build the cross on which the Jesus figure would be crucified. The fishmongers presumably would come along with the fish to feed the 5,000. So they would take the predominantly illiterate peasants or proletariats in villages and towns. They would swan into towns on carriages. They'd have master of the secrets and so on, who does the fire blowing or fire breathing, and angels are flying through the sky, etc., etc. But basically, there was a job of coordinating all of the guilds so that the mystery plays would flow seamlessly from stage one right to the end. Now, then, obviously in Shakespearean times, many of these plays were put on in the courtyards of the inns, and we have the Worshipful Company of Innholders, and that's why I've coined this phrase "guild hotels on sportsbook time," because I see the Langham Hotel that was commissioned in 1865, opened I think by the Prince of Wales, as the key to a global organization that can stage live action role plays where different guilds or different character classes are brought together in a synchronized way into a crime scene, to carry out subtasks of a crime that they hope will stay unsolved. And one way of solving or making sure that a crime is not solved is, for example, taking people affiliated with the worshipful company of environmental cleaners and putting them on the Pentagon lawn before impact of whatever it was that hit the Pentagon. It now becomes irrelevant what hit the Pentagon, because those environmental cleaners that I believe stayed overnight in the Pentagon City Hotel are on the Pentagon lawn a few minutes after impact, and they're picking up little bits of debris, putting it in a brown paper bag and taking it away. That's a felony, Jason.
Yeah.
Right?
I think it's a great thing that we've come back to this image so many times, and I like where you're going with this mystery play idea, David, because in many ways, back in those days, people didn't have, obviously we didn't have television, we didn't have motion pictures, it was more difficult to travel, so you really didn't interact with anybody outside of your village or whatever, and if there were a mystery play, that would be kind of a big event that everybody would come out for and watch. And then at the same time, now that we have entertainment all around us, people have movie theaters in their pockets, essentially, with the mobile phones and tablets. So something like what's happening here on the Pentagon lawn becomes a bit more akin to the mystery plays of the medieval times, because this is sort of putting out thoughts that are intended to be absorbed into the public consciousness.
Yeah, listen and obey. So here's what we're showing you. Do not question it, or we'll dismiss you as a conspiracy theorist, or ultimately we'll bankrupt you. In an extreme case, we'll kill you. Now, fascinatingly, the first patent, I believe, in the United Kingdom was granted to a stained glass maker, right? Now, back in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century, because the peasants were illiterate, these mystery morality or miracle plays were staged, and they were graphic. It was live action, and someone who was a carpenter could participate in the play. I know,
excuse me, David.
Jesus,
we've got an interesting comment here from, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Dave Cohen is telling us that he remembers when the Langham Hotel was an empty shell, and he wandered through it and its empty rooms with friends in about 1975. That's quite interesting, isn't it?
Yes, and the Langham Hotel was bought by the BBC because there was damage to the BBC during World War II. There was damage to the Langham Hotel, but actually the BBC used the Langham Hotel for studios, right? And also members of the Cambridge Five, I think Guy Burgess, the spies, stayed at the Langham Hotel. So the Langham Hotel could very easily have been a base for command and control of live action role playing going back to 1865, when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. But let me just roll back. So back in the 15th century, I believe, a patent was granted to a stained glass maker, right? And those stained glasses would be the kind of technology that would go into the great cathedrals. I was schooled at Kent College near Canterbury, Kent, and I was fascinated by the history of Canterbury, which goes back to Roman times and Thomas à Becket and the martyrdom of Thomas à Becket and its wonderful stained glass windows. But those stained glass windows gave the story of the Bible and what was to be believed in to the peasants who were illiterate. And in modern times, I believe the internet is providing to an increasingly scientific, and I don't want to be rude or unkind, illiterate public. And I would extend scientific illiteracy as an accusation or a description to most of our modern politicians. They don't understand the laws related to, for example, the conservation of energy, matter, space, and time, and the zeroth first and second law of thermodynamics. They wouldn't have a clue what that means, but what it means is that what you've been told about 911 is complete bullshit.
Right. In technical terms. No, that's okay.
Yes.
I think people understand where you're coming from. Now, David Cohen, who has explored the hotel there with his friends, is telling us that it was bought for a song by Hilton Hotels.
Yeah, and it's been upgraded now. But so now it's part of a chain. There are Langham Hotels around the world. I believe there's one in Hong Kong and one in China. So the the problem we always have is there's so many interesting red herrings to go. But I'd just like to say, for example, I believe this pandemic, or this threatened pandemic of the coronavirus, is a classic example by the BBC's Inner Party of a live action role play, because there are some very anomalous issues relating to this coronavirus. One is that at the Pierre Hotel in New York, I think on October of last year, there was a simulation hosted by Johns Hopkins University, partly funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation,
Yeah.
of a pandemic that would occur if a coronavirus, presumably of a certain re engineered category, was released into global systems and targets, like, I don't know, Wuhan City. Now, I'm not a microbiologist, but what intrigues me is, you know, is I like to go for a patent or the description of the patent for coronavirus. And it turns out that the coronavirus patent has been assigned to the Pirbright Institute in the United Kingdom, which is partly funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Okay, maybe that's just a pure coincidence. Going through the patent as an engineer, it's the best I can do to understand it. I find this term reverse genetics, which is interesting to me because, you know, I've been calling my operation, or the work that I do, as reverse crime scene investigation.
Right.
And reverse genetics is being used to attenuate that virus. It's got an application in particular in infectious diseases amongst birds and so on. And apparently the problem that the Pirbright Institute attempted to solve, or claims to have solved with the patent, is they can inject into the egg a vaccine that is sufficiently attenuated not to harm the embryo, but sufficiently strong to resist the antibodies released by the mother, the female, that has laid the egg. Now, as far as I can see, all you need to do is clip an artificial intelligence algorithm onto the reverse genetic machine, and basically, instead of attenuating the virus, you can activate it in a particular way, which I think is true of the coronavirus that is spreading around the world now, where you make the virus infectious during incubation. Now, the Chinese authorities are saying that, in fact, this is actually being spread before the symptoms appear. That makes it a lot more dangerous, Jason.
Yeah.
Right? Because it means, and that's what's happening. So now, is it possible, and let's say with the listeners, and if they join us in a mutual discovery, I could make the claim and then challenge our listeners to join us on Patreon and help us determine the possibility that the Pirbright Institute has actually developed the vaccine, or at least a theoretical model of the vaccine, and is withholding it from the market on the basis that if they can frighten, back to the listen and obey, and let me give you one of the mantras that might be listened and obeyed into the public wheel, if you will, or public consciousnesses. Please listen, or not even any please. We're telling you carbon dioxide is a pollutant, right? And just do what we tell you, which is kill yourself, because you're breathing out carbon dioxide at 40,000 parts per million. So every human being on the planet Earth is violating the cap set by these clowns.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to
and we know, David, of course, that Bill Gates is very interested in eugenics, and he's always sending these viruses around, sending them to Africa. Charles Ortel has done hundreds of episodes of Sunday with Charles, where he's talking about how this sort of false philanthropy model is being used to execute all kinds of schemes, mostly the Clintons stealing money. But, you know, we've heard that Planned Parenthood and the people who created were eugenicists, that Bill Gates comes from a long line of eugenicists, and some of these vaccines that are going into Africa are causing sterility and basically population reduction. It's an interesting theory about this coronavirus. I mean, how do people explain that there's a patent here for the coronavirus? Where does it talk about reverse genetics? I'm looking at the abstract. Can you see that on the screen share?
No, well, not in the abstract, but in the body of the text, it talks about it, to the best of my knowledge. Or that particular technology is applicable when you are developing these viruses and the vaccines.
There it is.
Right? And reverse genetics means, yeah, there we are, reverse genetics approach in order to rationally attenuate the BVC. Now, reverse genetics could equally be used, even though I'm not a microbiologist, to activate the virus. Right?
But do we know what reverse genetics is?
Well, reverse genetics means you take individual DNA strands or genes, I guess, within the virus, and you remove it, right, and see what impact that has on the virus, whether it is attenuated or activated. The point is, as you remove or change the viral code of these things, I don't say you're playing God, but it's extremely dangerous because you're assuming the goodwill of the people at the Pirbright Institute, or the fact that the Pirbright Institute is not vulnerable to hacking. And as we know, these ethical hackers that are swarming around us all the time, they understand at a very profound level how to get into an institution like the Bill and Melinda Gates, right? Or the City and Guilds of London, or the British Broadcasting Corporation,
or crowdsource
or the Langham Hotel.
Anything.
Or crowdsource the truth, and basically plant something. You know, the other day,
or Able Danger,
I got a letter, you know, I got an email suggesting that I opened some link that would give me an indication of how John Benet Ramsey died. And I went to the police and I said, this guy, individual, I think he's wanting me to download child pornography. And they said, well, we can't accept your complaint until you download it and then complain. I said, well, I'm not going to do that because that's the trap that they want me to fall into.
Right.
But let's go back, because Jane Addams, I think, is such an interesting character. Jane Addams, and she may have made 2 or 3 visits to Toynbee Hall, where she stayed there. That was the first university settlement house in the world, as I understand it. University settlement means you get the elites from Oxford and Cambridge. They come into the red light district and they teach the children or the young people how to read or write, hold a knife and fork, and ultimately they can go on careers. They can go on into careers, right, which ultimately have a more productive life than being the 12th child of a prostitute who's broke and drinking too much, etc., etc. So what I believe that I don't say she had a problem because you're on a minefield here, but if she's wandering around the Whitechapel area with her girlfriend, Ellen Starr, and she believes that the only reason why women go into prostitution is because they've been kidnapped into prostitution, and I don't believe that's true. I believe some women and some men are drawn into prostitution because they like the job, right? Now, back then, of course, there'd be huge economic pressures on women with 10 or 12 children to do whatever it takes to feed them. That I understand. But when you've got one of these people like Jane Addams, who then goes back to Chicago and they launch Hull House. Now, back in my Able Danger days, I alleged, or I floated the possibility that Hull House had become, at some time in its past, a pedophile brothel.
Well, what is Toynbee Hall supposed to be? It's just a rooming house?
Toynbee Hall is a university settlement house, right? Where they provide education and training for the children of poor people. Incidentally, Toynbee Hall was the place where Marconi demonstrated his wireless telegraph in 1899. That seems strange.
I'm sorry to ask you to repeat yourself because you said that obviously, but I mean, it's an educational thing, but like, what is it now? It looks like a hostel. It seems like a youth hostel or something.
It's still a university settlement. It's a founder organizer. That is not Toynbee. Well, that might be the entrance to Toynbee Hall, but Toynbee Hall is a sort of mansion. Maybe that's a branch office of Toynbee Hall. I can't quite make that out from
behind it.
Geographic.
Here. I think this is it.
Yes, that's it. I think the residential part where Jane Addams and Ellen Starr stayed, and that is within walking distance. If you put the location of the 5 canonical murders, it's right at the epicenter. So it's a short walking distance to each of the murders. The last murder, right, when they arrived, there was a chalk mark. Our guide took us on that place. I think they showed us the arch. On the chalk mark on the arch, right close to a blooded leather apron, which may or may not have been used by the killers of Mary Ann Kelly, I think it was. It had, "The Jews will be the men not to have done nothing," or not said to have done nothing, which is a very bizarre kind of phrasing that I think came by a telegraph cable. And I think it's an instruction or a blocking note, right, to set another group of people into the crime scene and possibly trigger a pogrom of the Jews. Right?
Well,
so
it's
now,
interesting, David, because on the tour,
go ahead.
Sorry there, but on the tour that people are going to be able to see when they join us in just about 20 minutes on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth, and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. The tour guide, Jamie, provides another possible explanation for who is being referred to, that the Jews is not, according to Jamie, referring to Jewish people, but this group of brothers who had murdered some guy in a particularly brutal way.
Yeah, and so when something like that is, let's say, planted, and remember then the chalk mark was erased, so it's only a memory that's shared amongst the police who were there, and apparently the chief of police was concerned that this would provoke a pogrom of the Jews, mass murder, because if it was attributed. So he had it erased. But what was intriguing, I think, is that the chief inspector detective assigned to that case was Frederick Aberline, right, who prior to being a detective was a clockmaker. And my fascination with timing, right?
Yes.
The next year, that's 1889, there was a raid in Cleveland Street of a male brothel.
A lot of weird stuff going on in England back in those days.
Right. In full communications with Chicago, I dare say, right? And so he felt that there was a cover-up related to the aristocrats who had been patronizing the male brothel in Cleveland Street, and he quit, that is Aberline quit, and became the European director for Pinkerton, the detective agency, right? So I think what you see here is amazing characters swanning in and out of these crime scenes. And just going back to 1888 or 1865, in the middle part of the 19th century, there was a concept of realism introduced into theater at that time, which was very burlesque and very mannered and very artificial. And the man who drove that, Thomas Robertson, introduced reality. So they called them the cup and saucer plays, because they'd have real cups and real saucers, and they'd make puddings on the stage. And a whole breed of actors were groomed around the idea of being as realistic as possible, representing the particular social class. Well, I think that's the modern equivalent of live action role playing. That is to say, there's a whole professional community by 1865 or around that time, when the Langham Hotel was commissioned, of actors who would work in the theater playing something as close as possible to a real life character. And I believe that from 1865 right through to the founding of the BBC in the 1920s, this concept of role playing took off, using modern technology to take the role playing out of the theater and into the real world for the use or the purposes of murdering people and getting away with it. That is to say, you would break up the crime scene into the responsibility of different groups or guilds, right? Each guild would have a very precise function, like including the worshipful company of stationers and newspaper makers would develop the scripts. And the scripts would be, let's say in modern terms, put up as a feed to the BBC, what is it called? The spoken text display apparatus for
Right.
the generation of television signals. And I believe those television signals being generated by that invention, which was assigned in August of 1998, actually represent digital blocking notes that are signals that can be sent to the different guilds or different character classes. Okay, get onto the Pentagon lawn, right? Pick the clothes, including the FBI t-shirts and the baggy pants and the rest of it. Pick up your brown paper bag, form a line across the Pentagon lawn. Someone will tell you what to do, and will tell you what to do when you've picked up all of the evidence on the Pentagon lawn. And those people are totally innocent of the role they're playing in a mass casualty murder for hire event. So they're playing their LARP roles, if you will, coordinated through modern technology of the type that the BBC has picked up. And I've now identified 8 patents, including the one that determines whether or not a Luciferian can be rehabilitated. Now, isn't that
Right.
interesting?
Whose patent was that again?
That's that guy who was the prime mover behind the
Oh, right.
Nexium scandal,
Keith
right? Where the women,
Renier, something like that.
yeah, Renier or something like that, where the women were branded around their private parts to indicate that they had accepted acting as slaves to Renier. So he's a mad as a hatter. He's got 147 patents, right?
Whoa.
Now, can you imagine the average, let's say, socially sophisticated woman where she's discovered to have accepted playing a slave role to this clown, right? And what I'm saying is then going from Jane Addams and the murder of the prostitutes in Whitechapel to the murder of the prostitutes between 1996 and 2002 in Vancouver. I think Starnet Communications was actually putting out or introducing or selling access to live action role plays where a wealthy individual could fly in to stay at a 4-star or 5-star hotel in Vancouver, book a room, maybe at Starnet 425 Carroll Street or out at the pig farm, get a woman, maybe and her child, into that studio where they could do what they liked to her on the condition that Starnet and Starnet's handlers, which I believe was Serco shareholders and the BBC, had access to the record, the film record of what may very well have been a snuff film or torture film. And now what that means, the people who have custody of those images own that individual for the rest of their life. And I believe by the time of the raid of August 1999, the Starnet network had 1 million blackmail victims around the world in 60 countries. And by the time that software or hardware had delivered that extra multiplier effect, I believe at the US Customs Service building in New York, I believe now there are at least 10 million victims of hardcore Starnet, adult and child pornography and online gaming around the world, including anything up to Bill Clinton, because that's what these people who are engaged in listen and obey propaganda on the world scale, they want total power over everyone. And if you're moving from the outer party to the BBC inner party, you have to go through that process before you're accepted into the inner party. And I believe there's an arbitrary number of senators that are about to vote on removal of Trump that would be targeted for that kind of blackmail, whether they have been or whether that will influence their vote. That vulnerability needs to be tested and quickly. In fact, I believe now the BBC, I don't know if shut down is appropriate, but someone, and particularly Christians, right, if they are truly enamored of the life led by Christ, they should look at the statues outside, even if it's just symbolic. They should look at the statues outside Broadcasting House and demand that those statues are destroyed because it's sacrilegious. I'm an average Christian, of whatever that means. I went to a Methodist boarding school in Canterbury in Kent. I was taught, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And inasmuch as you do it unto these, the least of my brethren, you do it unto me. So I think you and Jason, you may not be a Christian or whatever. I think those are two values that I'd like to think our listeners, our
Yeah.
subscribers, could adhere to and combine. And we ought to get rid of that garbage. That is an offensive, disgusting cultural symbol of what goes on in the BBC that led up to the Jimmy Savile scandal, who was a serial pedophile, basically, I believe, running a blackmail racket, quite possibly collaborating with Ghislaine Maxwell, the pimp who was working with Epstein. Over to you.
Yeah, I think it's certainly an indicator. The BBC is telling us what they're into and the kind of thing they're down with, particularly given their protection of Jimmy Savile. And when that woman, Jill Dando, started to try to report on this stuff, you've told us how she was murdered. So, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, they're telling us what they're all about, and you've got to go there and decipher these symbols. It's in our face, but yet it's also hidden. David, we're just about out of time for today, and I want to remind everybody that just recently Crowdsource the Truth began broadcasting in full HD at a much higher bit rate than we were before, with 24-bit audio going on over here. So I hope that people are enjoying the improved quality. If you've got a fast internet connection, you can watch us at 1080p and 5 megabits per second. You may need to turn the resolution down if you're still struggling in this new decade of 2020 with the older technology. But we're about to begin our show, our sponsor exclusive show, on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. People are going to enjoy a really excellent walking tour through London's Whitechapel area, where David and I explore all kinds of facts and details related to the Jack the Ripper murders. One thing that, David, I didn't know about at all, and see, this is what happens when you hang out with David Hawkins, whether it's in real life or on the internet. You learn all kinds of things that you didn't know. The despicable Nobel organization had awarded Jane Addams with a Nobel Peace Prize for her work in contributions to global socialism. So in addition to awarding the only U.S. president so far in history to be at war every single day of his presidency with a peace prize before he ever did anything, I'm talking about Barack Obama, this idiotic organization that should also be dismantled has given a Nobel Peace Prize to Miss Addams. So, David, perhaps in a future broadcast we'll explore some of these concepts more, but now I want to give people a few minutes to get over to Patreon and Subscribestar and to check out the upcoming broadcasts. So thanks again for another excellent show, David, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Jason.
And have a great day, everybody. Tune into Patreon and Subscribestar. You're not going to want to miss this.